You're listening to Mr. Radio, and I'm your host, Marshall. In 1959, the president of Bates College stood before a crowd and described a composer who fused old melody with modern technique to lift the hearts of men. That composer was Alan Hovhaness, a man who defended his original style at age 8 and went on to become one of the most exotically expressive voices in American music. Today, we are joined by William Holst, Alan's stepson, and the co-author of the brand new book, Alan Hovhaness, Unveiling, one of the great composers of the 20th century. Welcome to the show, William.
Hello.
This book is a deeply personal project. It was primarily written by your mother, the gifted, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, coloratura soprano Hinako Fujiwara Hovhaness, who passed away in late 2022. And then you stepped in to complete it for its October 2025 release. What was it like diving into her archives to finish this story? Did she leave behind a diary or a roadmap for you?
So we had talked several times about this book, that this was her final goal in life, was to publish this. Originally, she did write all the text for the book, and she kind of went through this phase after Alan's passing in 2000. She started writing poems she wrote hundreds of poems about Alan and, how their relationship was. In about 2005, she started remembering things about Alan, and she recalled that Alan would tell her many stories about different composers, Sibelius, Mozart, Beethoven, their personal stories, and she felt that she needed to capture Alan's personal side so that a lot of people know him as the composer and know his music, but they don't really know his personal side, and that's kind of what she's trying to capture here. So what ended up being that kind of changed into a love story because of the way she wrote it and her longing for her husband. That's kind of the beginning of that. So she left a draft form of that book. We had talked several times about it. Really what she wanted to do is it's not a literary masterpiece, but it does capture her voice. Me and my daughter were the actual editors of that book. We tried to make things a little bit more readable to the reader, but we wanted to keep what she called the orientalness in the writing. So we picked it up from there, did the editing, found all the pictures, did all the design work for the book cover and the dust cover and the box. But pretty much those are her words in the book.
In reading the book, I noticed that there were a lot of copies of handwritten notes. Is that what you had to go through, or was some of this typed?
We actually made copies of handwritten notes that Alan wrote to my mother. They did all their documentation was handwritten, nothing on the computer. Alan would write notes, in fact, they're sprinkled around the house, notes to my mother. Some of those are I think there is one to the Bacon Society. That is the original handwritten note that he sent to the Bacon Society.
And I know from reading the book, some of these notes were on paper napkins.
Yes, actually we have quite a few unpublished compositions that are on paper towels, napkins, just pieces of paper. Alan always was writing music. My mother actually has notebooks of poetry from approximately 2001 to 2025, all organized by date. The ones that are in the book, she actually embedded herself. Those poems that are in the book relate to the story that she had written. Hundreds of these poems that at some point we'd like to expose those to the public, because they're written for others to see.
One of the poems in the beginning of the book, Alan used to create a music piece for, and I believe it was called Pagan Saint. Would you care to read that for us?
Sure. Pagan Saint. The saint has died. The pagan rides this night once more. Wild horses through the sea, the sky in all its mystery. Wildly she rides, attended by all the gods of love desire. Passionate pagan, fierce and free, sing your song of ecstasy. Sing your song, triumphant cry, the saint has died, the pagan rides.
As I mentioned earlier, the book seems to be a duet between Hinako and Alan, and Hinako had a remarkably high vocal register. Did her, I guess, stratospheric voice directly change the way Alan composed his vocal works?
Absolutely. So there was a time period where, a lot of different reviewers and critics noticed that his compositions were higher, and there was a period there where he wrote symphonies and pieces specifically for my mother. So there was maybe a 10-year time frame where most of his works were for my mother.
I'd like to shift to Alan. To introduce Alan, I want to play a clip from the book's foreword. This is read by the author of the foreword, Maestro Gerard Schwartz. He's the music director of the Palm Beach Symphony. In this foreword, he quotes David Ewan's seminal description of Alan's style.
In David Ewan's seminal book from 1982 about American composers, he begins his entry about Alan Hovhaness, one of the most prolific composers of the 20th century, with some 300 compositions in all media and most in large structures to his credit. Hovhaness has arrived as an individuality of style of synthesizing the music of Western world with that of the East.
Synthesizing the music of the Western world with that of the East. In your view, what was Alan looking for in this synthesis? Was it a musical quest or a spiritual quest?
I believe it's a combination. So, as the story goes, he actually had a scholarship to Tanglewood in 1942, and two of his classmates, Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein, were in this class that they had, and one of the things they did in that class was they would play different individual students' compositions in the class, and then afterwards they would critique it. When they played Alan's, Aaron Copland talked over the music very loudly in Spanish, and then afterwards Leonard Bernstein called it secondhand garbage or ghetto music. And so Alan was really traumatized, and he ended up leaving Tanglewood because of that incident. And what he did was he went to have discussions with, he had a spiritual leader who was a psychic. His name was Herman D. Giovanni, and he had urged Alan to go back to his roots of our Armenian culture. And so not only did Alan go back, return to study Armenian culture, but he also traveled to India, Japan, and Korea. And in the process of studying their music. He had to understand their cultures, so he kind of lived in the outskirts of those areas. So he wasn't in the mainstream tourist areas. And so he picked up those cultures and embedded those music styles into his music. Alan was very spiritual, and so I think it is a combination of both those, culture and spiritual. Alan always said that he heard music in his head, and that's how he did his compositions. I think Alan was very much in tune with the universe, and so he could understand what the mountains, the trees, the waters, nature was saying, and he was able to interpret that into his music. And so, like I say, I think it's a combination of both cultural and mystical, spiritual type thought behind his music.
Now, you mentioned his gig at Tanglewood, where it didn't end up very well for him. As I understand, he ended up burning a lot of his works after that incident.
He actually burned over 1,000 pieces of his work. We do, however, I'm finding that we had recovered a few of those in that time period, but over 1,000 compositions is a fairly large number of compositions. But what I'm finding in this business, I'm originally kind of in the engineering. I just retired as an engineer. But what I'm finding in this business is that, a lot of the composers and conductors and people in this business are very compassionate about their work. And so, actually, I think what his traumatic experience at Tanglewood was actually a good thing for him to go and reinvent himself and then go off and study these other cultures.
The book isn't all about music, though. I think there's some colorful characters in this book. There was Eric Hawkins, who was apparently an outlandish choreographer, and he had in the book a hilarious, or maybe it was a shocking story about a performance where a nude dancer appeared on stage, much to Alan's surprise. Do you recall that incident at all?
He was probably shocked by that particular experience, but I think that in the music world, that that may not be too far off base.
You mentioned earlier about his spirituality. Can you talk a little more about Alan's spirituality?
As he went off and he actually lived these different cultures, I think the Indian culture probably had the biggest impact on his spirituality thinking. He believed in reincarnation. Supposedly he had been reincarnated from the Egyptian times, and his cat Raja was actually with him in those times, and then they reunited again, in the 1930s, 1940s time frame. He also was a musician that was a friend of Leonardo da Vinci. At one point, a psychic told him his name was Atalante Miglioriti, which was, if we looked it up on the internet, and he was a friend of Leonardo da Vinci.
I opened the show with Alan's Symphony No. 63, Loon Lake. Can you tell us a little more about this composition? And by the way, I understand that Peter Cohen, a music student at the University of Michigan, is rearranging that and planning to use it for educational purposes.
Right. Peter is doing an interpretation into a band rather than orchestra. So yeah, he's progressing fairly well on that. As far as that piece was commissioned by the New Hampshire Music Festival and the Loon Preservation Society. So when Alan was a child, he had an uncle. Alan lived in Arlington, Massachusetts. His uncle was in New Hampshire, and he would visit him quite often, and they would hike the hills there in New Hampshire, and they would paint different mountain scenes. During that time, he would hear the loons, often the waters with their call, and so that piece was written about his experience when he was a young child, hearing the loons off in the lake. And I looked it up earlier. There is actually a loon lake there in New Hampshire.
I think that I have been to Loon Lake, and I think I was camping around there, or else there's another Loon Lake in Maine or in Canada. But in listening to the Loon Lake, I would close my eyes, and I can just imagine myself being back in that campsite. I'd like to listen to a different side of his work, and this is what's been called a darkly dazzling Macedonian mountain dance, and it's performed by Sahran Arzouni at the 2011 Centennial Celebration.
Macedonian mountain dance, I have nothing to say about it, except that it is one of those pre-Armenian 1930s pieces. And it's fun. That's all I have to say.
That piece is notoriously difficult due to its uneven meters. Was Alan writing for virtuosos, or was that complexity just a natural byproduct of the folk traditions he loved? And who was responsible for putting that massive centennial celebration together?
I think that was just a natural way that Alan wrote. What I understand from talking to Alan is that he actually started composing at the age of 4, and he had actually invented an 11-line staff, and it was too complicated for his mother to play on the family organ. That particular piece sounds very, very much like Alan's music. I can tell that. As far as the organizing of the centennial, I'm not sure who organized it, but I know Alan has written pieces and a symphony to celebrate the centennial of the United States.
Now, you mentioned his mother. Apparently, when he presented his mother with this music, she threw it in the garbage?
I believe that's correct. So what Alan used to do is he would compose at night when his parents were sleeping, and then he would hide his compositions under the bed. But yes, if the mother found it, she would confiscate it. She was she was brought up in a religious home. Her father was a minister, and so there were very strict rules in his house. I think they supported Alan very much, but they were looking for him to become something more technical. His father was a biochemist at Tufts, and so I think they were looking for him to become more that directional. But once he had kind of established himself in the music world, and they were very supportive and proud of Alan.
What I discovered was in my research that Alan's influence reached far beyond the concert hall. For example, most people don't, including myself, don't realize that Carlos Santana's Transformation Day is actually an adaptation of Alan's Mysterious Mountain. How did Alan feel about his work being adopted by rock and jazz legends?
I think Alan was happy about it. I don't know if he actually talked to me about it, but certainly he was in the music world. There's many different genres, but they do coordinate somewhat, and so there are many occurrences of rock stars knowing of Alan or talking with him. Alan was kind of connected to several people at Woodstock, not only Carlos Santana, but Richie Havens. In the 1960s, when he lived in New York, there was actually a group he was part of, that a very small group that was artists and musicians and that type, like John Cage and Yoko Ono. So Alan actually told me stories about him driving around downtown New York, and Yoko Ono would be reciting poems to him. So he actually was, knew Yoko prior to John Lennon and the Beatles.
I think he also was either influenced by or influenced Ravi Shankar.
That's correct. Yeah. So in 1960, he did go to India, and he met both Ravi and his brother Uday, who was a dance choreographer. And Alan actually wrote a symphony for orchestra and sitar for Ravi. And Alan was a big promoter of Ravi Shankar in the United States. And in fact, I don't know if he was the first person to bring him over, but again, like in 1966, the Beatles were very much interested in the Indian movement, and Sgt. Pepper's had a couple of songs there with sitar. So, and George Harrison, of course, followed that on. But, Alan actually knew Ravi prior to, his exposure in the United States. And I had talked to a few music historians, and I understand that Alan's music had a lot of influence on some of the early rock and roll. In addition, I don't know where this is documented, but Alan was actually a ghostwriter for the jazz musician Artie Shaw. So I don't know if there's any documentation of what pieces he actually provided him, but he had his hand in some jazz music also.
When I listened to Carlos Santana after reading about Alan's influence on him, as soon as I heard the first couple of notes, I could hear Alan in that music. How did your mother step in to manage the business and the personality of a man who was essentially a mystic?
So Alan was not necessarily a good manager of his music. In fact, in his early years, he gave a lot of his music away. he was not concerned necessarily with monetary value. He just wanted to create music and have everyone at least have the opportunity to hear it. So he was not a good manager of his music. He was more or less his duty was to produce music. My mother came in and started managing his music, getting all the copyrights, making sure that they had the royalties lined up, all the financial side, the promotions and things like that. And Alan was pretty much the music producer.
You mentioned that you were working for Boeing. You were a technical writer for Boeing, and that's a world of precision and logic. Why did you choose a non-linear approach for this memoir?
Good point. So actually I was a avionics systems engineer, but had written several documents that were, like you say, very structured. Again, we tried to keep the way my mother had written it, and so she was, the other side of the brain from me, but the biggest thing was the content, the information in it, not necessarily the literary, wording or structure or anything like that. We just wanted to make it more of a heartfelt, book that people can relate to. As you can see through the book, the structure really is the different types and levels of love. They go through the romantic side. They go through the family portion of love. They go through, while he's being sick, being able to care for him. And then at the end, it's more of the longing for your lost partner. So that kind of is the main structure of the book is going through those different phases of their love.
Towards the ending of the book, the way your mother handled Alan's sickness was very touching. But then I had the impression that after Alan died, she had second thoughts about what she did. Am I correct in that assumption?
Right. And I think throughout, she probably added maybe 2 to 3 years onto his life. And, several people had told her, just, it's time, just let him go. But, I think both my mother and Alan didn't want to let go. She poured her heart out to make sure that he was taken care of very well. She was with him 24 hours a day, watching him. And, Alan, on the other hand, was also very much wanting to stay with my mother. And so he had he went through a lot of tests and seeing a lot of doctors, and that was showing his love that he wanted to remain there with her.
I was talking about nonlinear approach, so I'm going to have a nonlinear approach to my question here. Tell me about the notes at the beginning of the book. There's a picture of a cat, and I have to tell you that these notes have been keeping me up at night trying to figure out, because I do not read music, and that's a whole other story of my life. But according to my sources, the music is a trio for violin, viola, and cello. And I have been trying to get my music friends to play it for me, and perhaps in the coming months somebody will come through and play this for me. But can you tell me a little bit about the notes and the cat?
Raja was a big influence on his life. I think there was the period there in the 1930s where he was the organist at Watertown Armenian Church in Arlington, and he more or less dedicated his life to his music. And during that time, Raja was a big part of his life, probably a closer partner than any of its wives during that period. And so we thought it was very important. And I think Alan would have really appreciated, having that picture there. So, we're big cat lovers ourselves. And, whenever Alan would come and visit us, we had cats, and Alan, always had great connections with the cats.
Before we go, I want to offer a quick Easter egg for the listeners. If you look at the four edges of the book, you're going to see musical notes, and my fact checker, Steve Freitas, who worked with Maestro Schwartz, identified these as Opus 374 for harp and guitar, and I put a link into that piece for our show notes. Where else can our listeners go to discover more about Alan?
We have a website. It's Alan Hovhaness. That's HOVHANESS.com, or music.com. So again, that's AlanHovhanessmusic.com. There you can actually, contact us. You can order music that it will be coming in the next couple of weeks. You can actually order some of the music off online. And then, of course, you can purchase the book through that website also. And, of course, currently I'm working on a timeline of all the places that Alan visited and traveled to. And so if anyone out there has any kind of stories about Alan or just comments about Alan, they can go there and leave some comments. I'm gathering information, so that is a good place to contact us.
Perhaps the best way to summarize Alan's contributions to the world of music is through the words of Maestro Gerard Schwartz.
His music has lived on and will continue to because of its beauty and passion.
The book is Alan Hovhaness, Unveiling One of the Great Composers of the 20th Century. William Holst, thank you for helping us unveil the man behind the mystery.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You've been listening to Mr. Radio, and I'm your host, Marshall. This program was written and produced by Marshall. Symphony No. 63, Loon Lake, Opus 411, was performed by the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, directed by Stuart Robertson. Special thanks to Maestro Gerard Schwartz, Artistic and Music Director of the Palm Beach Symphony. Charles Americanian, Executive and Artistic Director, and Liam Erb, Production Director for Other Minds. Our fact-checker was Steve Freitas, and our theme music was performed by Ululation. Mr. Radio is available wherever you get your podcasts, including iTunes and Spotify. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And don't forget to tune in next time for another episode of Mr. Radio.